Now, coming to our faculty, we have about 700 faculty, and they work in all areas of technology, all the engineering branches, all the sciences, including social science, economics, policy, and many other areas. And across all these areas, they are regarded as amongst the best in the world. They have won all kinds of international recognition, whether it is citations, fellowships, whatever it is. We are amongst the best universities in the world. And as I said, research has a particular emphasis today. And we carry out research in many areas. But today, particularly, I want to point out that we are doing a lot of research in the area of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are very important for not only us, but for the younger generation who is sitting here today and future generations, so that we leave behind a world which is better than the world we came into, hopefully, if we do it right. And so IIT Bombay is helping towards those goals. So amongst the things we are doing, we have a top-notch program in climate studies. We have a number of people working on photovoltaics, on battery technology, which are all important for weaning us off from fossil fuels. We also have a center on carbon capture, which will hopefully help to reduce the carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. We also have a strong policy group, and this is very important because policy helps drive it. For example, Dr. Shende, who I mentioned, he helped create the UN policy on ozone layer, which has had a tremendous success. So that's also something. We want to solve the problem. We are not just doing narrow academic research, but we want to solve problems in the real world. We are also working on affordable healthcare, including AI and digital technologies. We have very strong groups on that. We also have a number of people working on technologies for rural areas. So with all these efforts, we want to create a better future for our citizens, particularly those at the bottom of the pyramid. That's something we don't want to lose sight of. We are not just working for those at the top, but for those at the bottom. So we're very happy that the UN Secretary General is here today, and he can see some of the effects that what UN started 64 years back have achieved today. He saw the exhibits outside, and I hope he found them interesting. And it also gives us great pleasure to note that Secretary General Mr. Guterres is himself in an earlier avatar, not today, an electrical engineer from the Technical University of Lisbon. Of course, that was long back, so for the students who are sitting here waiting to ask him questions, please go easy on the electrical engineering questions. So, sir, it's a real pleasure to have you visit a technological institution again after perhaps many years. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan. I now invite the United Nations Resident Coordinator in India, Mr. Shombi Sharp, to deliver his address.
Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations and members of the UN delegation, Excellency Ambassador Kamboj and members of the delegation of Ministry of External Affairs, President of ORF, our dear friend Samir Saran, and Deputy Director of IIT Bombay, representatives of Maharashtra, Mumbai governments, and most of all, dear students, dear youth, Namaskar. Aj tumhala betun khub anand zala. मुझे IIT Bombay में आकर बहुत खुशी हुई, especially as the Deputy Director reminded us that the United Nations system, UNESCO, and the precursor to UN Development Program played a part in helping establish this august institution. So on behalf of the United Nations system here in India, it's a great honor to be celebrating with all of you this confluence of multiple celebrations. India's 75th year of independence, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, the India-UN partnership, and the upcoming United Nations Day, formally marked on Monday, but I believe we are celebrating in an excellent way here today. Again, all in the context of welcoming our chief guest, Secretary General, to India. Wanted just very briefly to thank ORF and Ministry of External Affairs and IIT Bombay for this fantastic arrangement. I know the SG was impressed by all of the exhibitions. I will be very brief, and my message is very simple, that in this turbulent world, as the Secretary General has powerfully argued in our common agenda, we need multilateralism with the UN at the heart more than ever before. And in the nearly 1 year that I've had the pleasure and opportunity to tour around this incredible country across so many different states, it's incredibly clear to me, from the villages to the center, that the world needs India more than ever before. The world's largest democracy, greatest contributor to peacekeeping since the beginning, pharmacy to the world, a rising climate champion with ambitious Panchamrit commitments and the Life Initiative, the largest youth generation in history, and an immense demographic dividend to harness in the coming decades. This incredible potential of you, the young people in the audience, and the rest of us, Vojo Dil Se Young Hai. A leading national public digital tech stack, a dynamic private sector and research sector, as we're seeing here, pushing forward renewable solutions, solar, electric vehicles, mobility, green hydrogen, and on and on and on. And we've estimated that India is alone home to 25, upwards of 50% of some of the global targets for the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you move forward, and as India increasingly shares development best practice through the international platforms, G20 coming up leadership, through South-South cooperation, the world also will move forward. So just to say that we, to conclude, we and the United Nations system here, all of our agencies are committed partners to working with all of you to ensure that this growth story leaves no one behind, that India avails itself of its full potential, women, girls, vulnerable populations, for the SDGs. And we are very pleased to be finalizing our new offer of partnership to India, the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework 2023 to 2027, which we hope to sign next month. So looking forward to a bright road ahead, a deep partnership, and let me conclude by wishing all of you a very happy United Nations Day. Aap sabko UN Day ki hardik shubhkamnaएं. Thank you very much. Bahut dhanyawad. And again, welcome to the Secretary General.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp. I now request President of the Observer Research Foundation, Dr. Sameer Saran, to introduce our chief guest, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Thank you, Falguni. And since Shombi spoke in Hindi, I'll speak in English. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our chief guest this morning. It's also a very daunting task for two reasons. He needs no introduction, and I'm speaking in front of a very young audience who are going to be fact-checking me on Wikipedia and Google all the time. So I am going to stay away from facts as I introduce him. But before that, let me welcome the Secretary General, Ambassador Kamboj, and all the visiting dignitaries to this beautiful campus in Mumbai. And we are all delighted that you've chosen us as the venue where you will speak to us on this very important occasion of the impending UN Day as well as India at 75. Two institutions that the world needs more of if we have to respond to some of the challenges ahead. Let me try and introduce our chief guest. What does he stand for? And over a long arc of political career, from where he led his country to now where he leads the world, he has stood for delivering dignity. Dignity to those who are underserved, unprotected, and sometimes invisibilized. He has a gender-first agenda, and he has a planet-first objective. And he has reduced the average age of the United Nations headquarters. There are more young people enthused and engaged on UN-led activities, courtesy the Secretary General. His fan club, people who stand on him, are huge. Only the young people will understand what I said. He has a whole cadre and generation of followers who swear by him because he has been able to relate to them and bring them to the plane on key issues the world needs to respond to. Why are we lucky to have him? In the last few years, we've had the pandemic that has literally affected all of us. Economies have been devastated, people died, countries in many ways were enfeebled, and multilateralism and globalization were the victims. I want to quote you, sir. In 2017 at the Raisina Dialogue, you made an impassioned appeal for multilateralism. And you said this has to be realized through integrated approaches, greater collaboration, and building on common values. You said this in 2017. Today, more than ever, we need to recommit ourselves to exactly this mission. The Secretary General is known to be one of the finest crisis managers. From his work in his own country to his job during the time when he was helping refugees and displaced people, and to, of course, helping us navigate the world as we sought to get past the past 2.5 years. We are very lucky to have someone who understands silent diplomacy. In a world of headlines and tweets and posts, silence can be golden. And sometimes what happens behind the scenes can be far more effective for the world that emerges. Thank you, Secretary General, for being here. Finally, as we turn 75, Secretary General, we at ORF and of course the NEA and many other institutions, as you heard from the director of IIT, are committed to do more with the UN. This year, with my friend Shombi Sharp, we hosted an India Day at the UN, and the language was English. But we created a series of events that brought India's own journeys, successes, failures, experiences, solutions, technologies, and innovations for others to partake in. And increasingly in the days ahead, we will bring the world to those stages as well so that India can learn with them as well. The journey is of companionship, the destination is common, and you, sir, are the beacon for multilateralism. I'm delighted to welcome you to deliver the address today to all of us.
Professor Chowdhury, dear friends, all protocol observed, I am delighted to be here with all of you. This institution is 54 years old, and as it was said, 54 years ago, I was a student of the university in Lisbon, and my school was called, I will say it in Portuguese, but you will understand, Instituto Superior Técnico. And my dream at the time was to be a researcher in physics. Now, we don't control our destiny. We lived in a dictatorship that was at the same time an oppressive colonialist regime. We had, fortunately, a revolution. That revolution led to the liberation of the former colonies and to democracy in Portugal. And at that time, as a student, I was a volunteer working in the slums of Lisbon in different areas related to health, education, and I felt a compulsion to get involved directly into politics. And so I never became a researcher in physics. And I am envious of all those that will be able to contribute to the well-being of humankind through the scientific work that is as necessary as the political work to make sure that we can live in a better world. And I'm very pleased to start this visit to India because I have a double love affair with India. First, because of India's culture, history, India's people and its contribution to today's world and to the world civilization. And the second reason, because my wife was born in Goa. So, with this double love affair, I'm delighted to be here with all of you. And it is indeed a pleasure to be in the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai, to talk about the partnership between India and the United Nations and strengthening South-South cooperation. And I'm also delighted to celebrate with you the 75th anniversary of India's independence, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. I congratulate India on its achievements over the last 75 years as the world's largest democracy and now as the fastest growing major economy. As an engineering graduate with a lifelong commitment to education, I feel, as I said, very much at home at ITT Mumbai. The Institute's global mission and long history of transformative education make this the ideal place to talk about the strong partnership between India and the United States. India was a founding member of the United Nations. The drafters of the UN Charter took great inspiration from Gandhiji's message of peace, non-violence, and tolerance. And thanks to an Indian woman, Hansa Mehta, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the equality of women and men. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Human beings. Some people thought it should be all men, linked to the old traditions of the past. Now, as a founding member of the Non-Aligned Movement and the Group of 77, India has always been a leading advocate for the concerns of and aspirations of developing countries. India is also the biggest provider of military and police personnel to UN missions, including the first all-women UN police contingent to a peacekeeping mission. Over 200,000 Indian men and women have served in 49 peacekeeping missions since 1948, a remarkable contribution to peace in the world. As a member of the Security Council for the past 2 years, India has contributed significantly to promoting multilateral solutions and to address crises, and welcome India's initiative on greater accountability for those who target peacekeepers. So, dear students, dear members of the faculty, our world today faces mounting global challenges. Countries still reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic are being battered by energy, food, and cost of living crises, accelerated by the war in Ukraine. Old and new conflicts have displaced more than 100 million people all around the world. The devastating impact of climate disruption is more apparent by the months. You have felt this across India, from heat waves in the grain-growing heartlands to flooding in the northeast and coastal states. Halfway to the finish line, some of the most fundamental sustainable development goals have gone into reverse, moving backwards instead of moving ahead. More people today are hungry, more people are living in poverty than a few years ago. And today I would like to focus on India's unique opportunity to shape the global agenda as a principal player and a model for others. As the home of 1/6 of humanity and the world's largest generation of young people, India can make or break the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. India's success in translating the Sustainable Development Goals into action will mean the difference between success and failure for up to half of the global Sustainable Development Goal targets, for more than any other country. India's recent development journey is characterized by high-impact programs delivered at scale. This includes the world's largest food-based social protection scheme and the massive expansion of access to clean water and sanitation services. India's whole-of-society approach to development combines old-fashioned community outreach with cutting-edge technology. Many of your most successful programs are driven by world-class public digital infrastructure, which aligns more than 1 billion mobile internet users with financial inclusion initiatives online, namely health services, and more. Indian women have played a central role in many of these initiatives, from health workers at community clinics to scientific research and technology. And today, the number of Indian women and men taking STEM degrees are nearly at parity. India's digital health platform, CoWIN, hosted the world's largest vaccination program for COVID-19, delivering more than 2 billion doses. And the United Nations has accompanied India in all these development milestones, from the World Food Programme support for India's public distribution system to the UN Development Programme's partnership with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. India also demonstrates a practical and generous approach to global solidarity and South-South cooperation. It was the first country to launch a single-country South-South cooperation support framework via the UN-India Development Framework Partnership, and indeed our relationship with India on development is a two-way partnership. From your donations of medicines, equipment and vaccines at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, to your humanitarian assistance and development finance, Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, your increasing impact on the international stage, India is today a partner of choice of the United Nations. And India's upcoming presidency of the G20 will be an important opportunity to bring the values and vision of the developing world to the top table of the global economy. There is an interesting coincidence. We have the presidency of Indonesia, followed the presidency of India, followed by the presidency of Brazil, and followed by the presidency of South Africa, which means that for the first time in history, four crucial developing countries will lead the G20. And it is an opportunity that cannot be missed to make our international economic and financial relations that are extremely unfair. There is an opportunity we cannot miss to deeply reform institutions, procedures, regulations, and norms to make sure that we have a world economy for all and not only a world economy for the rich. Now, I welcome your declared aim of sharpening the G20 approach to the 2030 agenda. These successive four successive G20 presidencies by developing countries could be used to create a space for comprehensive strategies to address current global crises. And I count on India's support in mobilizing G20 countries around debt relief. Many developing countries are at or near debt distress and require multilateral action, including the expansion and the extension of the G20 debt service suspension initiative. We live in a dramatic situation for developing countries. When the COVID-19 emerged, there was a huge inequality in the world in relation to vaccines. But as important as the inequality in relation to vaccines was the inequality in relation to the resources available for recovery. $16 trillion in the world were mobilized for recovery through direct financing by states to guarantees and to other financial mechanisms. The United States and Europe have printed money. Now, of course, printing money is done in a very sophisticated way through interventions of the central banks, through different kinds of buying bonds, but it is like in the past, printing money. But most developing countries could not print money, because if they would print money, their currencies would go down the drain. And so the truth is that the recovery from the pandemic was largely concentrated from the financial point of view in the developed countries. Developing countries have received very little from the financial instruments of recovery. And the result, because of the dramatic impact in their societies and the need to support their people, was a dramatic increase in debt. And we have today a large number of countries that are on the verge of collapse And we do not have any effective instrument of debt relief in today's world, especially for middle-income countries that were dramatically impacted. Imagine a small island development country, like countries in the Caribbean or in the Pacific or even in the Indian Ocean. That small island has 40% of GDP with tourism. For 2 years, there were no tourists. That small island had to import fuel, food, and now the prices of food and fuel are skyrocketing. So that small island accumulated debt. But it is considered a middle-income country, so it has no access to any debt relief instrument and no access for concessional funding from international financial institutions. That is why I've said several times the international financial system is morally bankrupt. It was devised by the rich to serve the interests of the rich. This is the moment to change it. And that is why I encourage India's engagement in deep reform of the global financial architecture, which, as I said, favors those that conceived it and is terribly detrimental to the interests of developing countries, especially the least developed countries. Now, the climate crisis could be the greatest barrier to our collective development aspirations, and India is no exception. It is already a grave threat to India's economy, agriculture and food sector, and to the health, lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. Record-breaking heat waves, droughts and floods in parts of India are causing havoc already. These are a foretaste of what it is to come without much greater global climate action. Climate devastation is a reality at 1.2 degrees of warming. Now, current global commitments put us on track to more than double this level. And let's not forget, G20 countries are responsible for 80% of global emissions, and they must take the lead in cutting greenhouse gases. Now, it's important to fully recognize the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities in light of national circumstances. This is the sentence that resulted in a compromise in the Paris Agreement to take into account that the effort that is required to developed countries must be bigger than the effort that is required to developing countries, even if all must contribute to our objective. Now, while fully recognizing this principle, the truth is that I've also asked the emerging economies to take an extra step to close the so-called mitigation gap. But they can only do this with the financial and technical support of developed countries. This is the moment in which we will be defeated by climate change forever if there is not an historical pact between developed countries and the emerging economies. Of course, small island developing states do not contribute much to climate change. Most African continent do not contribute much to climate change. But today, thanks to the development of countries like India or China or Indonesia, there is a contribution also from emerging economies. But it is clear those emerging economies cannot go as fast as developed countries because of their industrial structure, their agricultural structure, and because in the past they have contributed much less to climate change. So we need an historical pact in which developed countries strongly support with financial and technical resources emerging economies to allow for combined efforts of the two with extra requirements from developed countries to allow us to defeat climate change and to keep the temperature under control, if possible, and I would say it is necessary, at 1.5 degrees. Now, this is why I have called for coalitions of support around countries. I did it in the Glasgow COP, namely India, with ambitious plans to accelerate the deployment of renewables. And I therefore welcome the establishment of the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnerships. Such partnerships can help emerging economies to accelerate the deployment of renewables through a closely coordinated process that is nationally owned. And above all, a just energy transition will benefit millions of Indians and other peoples who suffer the triple impact of pollution, energy poverty, and the climate crisis. And I welcome India's leadership in converting domestic climate action into international collaboration through the International Solar Alliance and International Coalition for Disaster-Resilient Infrastructure. The United Nations and I have a very clear perspective. We need a renewables revolution, but that renewables revolution will only be possible with effective solidarity of the developed world with developing countries that are also needed in this revolution, also to the benefit of their own populations. And critical renewable technologies, such as battery storage, should be treated as global public goods. I had the opportunity to see a very interesting development just a few minutes ago. So we need to diversify supply chains and manufacturing capacity, and we must reduce the cost of capital for renewable energy investments in the developing world. One of the problems we have today is that it's much cheaper to produce electricity with solar or wind than with coal or gas. But the cost of electricity produced by solar or wind is essentially the investment cost. And the cost of electricity produced by gas or coal is the running cost of burning those fuels. And today we have a dramatic situation. Already 20 countries are paying interest rates 10 points above the American Treasury bills. So the only way to allow for a renewables revolution in the developing countries is reducing the cost of capital in developing countries. And for that, there must be a concerted effort, namely making the multilateral development institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the IMF, understand that beyond the loans that they can provide, they need to be able to leverage through guarantees, through first risk takers, to leverage massive doses of private finance to allow to reduce the cost of capital in developing world, for the developing world to be able to do the just transition that is necessary for their economies. And I urge India to become a global superpower in renewables technology and a manufacturing hub to fuel this revolution around the world. And I've seen through the examples that were shown to me that you will have the capacity to do so. And I look forward to work with Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government to drive this agenda forward. And I will continue to urge developed countries who bear a historic responsibility to provide the necessary finance in adequate conditions to the developing world. The Lifestyle for Environment initiative that the Prime Minister Modi will launch, and I will be there tomorrow, seeks to create a self-reliant model that transforms consumption habits for the benefit of all in India and around the world. And I can see here today that India's research and innovation ecosystem is strong and vibrant. And if I may be allowed to address the students in this hall, I urge you to use your considerable talents to tackle the planetary emergency we face, to develop renewable technology, to find new solutions to pollution and to biodiversity loss. And naturally, I respectfully urge you not to work for those who are wrecking our climate. I've been saying that to university students all over the world. Don't look only at the salary of your future work. Look at the contribution of the companies or entities for which you'll work to have a better world, a more sustainable and inclusive world. And you'll feel much happier afterwards. There is unfortunately a number of people in the world that still have only one objective: one day to be the richest person in the cemetery. That doesn't bring happiness. Now, COP27 in Cairo will demand strong leadership from India as we accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I count on India to participate at the highest level and to deliver a balanced outcome that recognizes the importance of adaptation, mitigation, and finance. We also need to make serious progress on loss and damage in Cairo. Loss and damage will be crucial to reestablish trust between developing countries and developed countries. And loss and damage is, first of all, the recognition that it exists, and second, the assumption of responsibilities to be able to address the needs that it generates. And that is why adaptation is so important, and funding to adaptation is so important. If you have a flood and you have a road at the level of the ground, the road will disappear. If you have the road system that is higher, the road will not disappear. If you have mangroves all around your coastal areas that are more vulnerable, the coastal areas will resist. If the mangroves have been wiped out, the coastal areas will not resist. And all that requires huge investment. And that investment needs to be financed through international cooperation, and the recognition of loss and damage might be a very important instrument to do so. As climate impacts grow, we must scale up financing for loss and damage to support the world's most vulnerable people, communities, and nations. And on this global challenge, all countries have to move together. We need an honest conversation about rights and responsibilities. And it is clear that countries that had no part in creating this crisis cannot continue to pay the highest price for it. Dear friends, India has been a global leader from the moment of its birth. Your non-violent independence movement encouraged anti-colonial struggles around the world. Your victory was a catalyst that helped to end the long epoch of European imperialism everywhere. As an elected member of the Human Rights Council, India has a responsibility to shape global human rights and to protect and promote the rights of all individuals, including members of minority communities. India's voice on the global stage can only gain in authority and credibility from a strong commitment to inclusive and respect for human rights also at home. And the Indian model of plurality is based on a simple but profound understanding. Diversity is a richness that makes your country stronger. The understanding is the birthright of every Indian, but it is not a guarantee. It must be nurtured, strengthened, and renewed every day in this and in every other society. By practicing the values of Gandhi, by security and upholding the rights and dignity of all people, especially the most vulnerable, by taking concrete action for inclusion, recognizing the enormous value and contributions of multicultural, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic societies, by condemning hate speech unequivocally, by protecting the rights and freedoms of journalists, human rights activists, students, and academics, and by ensuring the continued independence of India's judiciary. This is the India that the world has celebrated, and I urge Indians to be vigilant and to increase your investments in an inclusive, pluralistic, diverse community and society. In India, as across the world, much more needs to be done to advance gender equality and women's rights. And this is a moral imperative and a multiplier for prosperity and sustainability. No society can reach its full potential without equal rights and freedoms for women, men, girls, and boys. Dear friends, India is at a decisive moment. You have an unprecedented opportunity to speak up for the global south and to lead by example as a model of resilience and an advocate for sustainable development, global financial reform, and climate justice. And the decisions that you make today and the path you chart over the next 18 months could have a global resonance for decades to come. I urge India to continue speaking up for peace, to expand its global leadership, to align its development and its foreign policy with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, to find innovative solutions to today's global crisis. As your first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, said at the dawn of independence 75 years ago, and I quote, "Our dreams are for India, but they're also for the world. For all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart." Across the United Nations system, at the global level, through the UN Resident Coordinator and the UN Country Team of Agency funds and programs, we are proud to be your committed partners. Let's work together for the next 75 years to create a more peaceful, just, sustainable, and inclusive world for all, and I trust India will give a fundamental contribution for that to be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very powerful address, Secretary General. And I guess what we're going to really do today is turn it over to you guys, the young minds, the students, to speak to the Secretary General. And we're going to try and get as many questions as possible. But before that, Mr. Secretary General, I wanted to, I just got a glimpse of your statement at the memorial for the Mumbai terror attacks. You were there, you made a very powerful statement. In fact, you also alluded to us having to do much more. Fundamental question to you. Why is it that the world is incapable of responding to terror? Why is it that terrorism has become a weapon of choice for certain actors? And why is it that culprits are still roaming free? Why can't we agree on terrorism? And you've been working on this for over 10 years now. Personally, you've been invested in this issue. Why can't we agree?
First of all, there is not enough cooperation in fighting terrorism as such. Terrorism became a global issue. You have terrorists that move from Afghanistan to Syria, from Syria to Libya, from Libya to the Sahel, back to Yemen, and from Yemen again to Afghanistan. Today, terrorist networks use sophisticated technologies. Terrorist networks use the deep internet and a number of instruments that are deep to detect. And the international cooperation to fight terrorism is far from being sufficiently organized to be effective in fighting terrorist organizations. That became a global affair. Terrorism is no longer a local issue in which people do things because of, wrong ideas they have at local level. Terrorism became a global phenomenon, and our instruments to address terrorism, to fight terrorism, are not effectively coordinated at global level. Second, geopolitical divisions also contribute to the difficulties in addressing terrorism in an effective way. And third, there is not enough work in the prevention of terrorism, in building resilience of communities against terrorist ideas. We see how terrorism proliferates, and the dramatic inequalities that exist in the world and other forms of injustice lead some people that is weaker, I would say, in their capacity to understand things in a proper way, lead some people to extremist conceptions, to extremist ideas, and we are not doing enough in the prevention of the expansion of violent extremism in the world. So there is a long way to go, and terrorism has not received the priority it should. That is the reason, and I said it this morning, that my first reform was to create an Office of Counterterrorism in the United Nations. Terrorism was dealt by a small team in the Department of Political Affairs, practically doing nothing, and today we have a solid department that is providing technical support to countries around the world, and that is enhancing international cooperation that is absolutely vital. So we really need to understand that terrorism today is a global phenomenon, and that we all need to cooperate effectively in intelligence, in counterterrorism action, but also in the prevention of violent extremism to be able to defeat it.
Ambassador Kamboj, if I may turn to you, the Secretary General laid out an agenda for India-UN over the next 75 years. How do you see this new dynamic, India at 75 and India's engagement with the UN looking ahead?
Well, thank you very much, Samir. And needless to say, I'm very pleased to be here and honored to share the stage with the Secretary General. I'd like to make 3 points here. First and foremost, I think we all agree that India has a very deep and abiding commitment to multilateralism. Now, some of the speakers ahead of me have already said so. India was one of the founding members of the United Nations. India is among the top 25 financial contributors to the United Nations. And we like to believe, and we've proved it again and again, that we are a voice of reason, we are a bridge builder, and above all, we speak for the developing South. The second thing that I would like to make, point I'd like to make here is that this is not just empty rhetoric. We literally walk the talk. Let me give you two very recent examples. During the course of the COVID pandemic, I think all of you know by now, but it bears reiteration yet again, that India supplied 240 million doses of COVID vaccines to over 100 countries across the globe. I think, personally, I felt very proud as an Indian diplomat. I think that is one of the most powerful statements in as far as vaccine equity and vaccine support is concerned. Incidentally, Secretary General, as you recall, 2 lakh doses were also supplied to United Nations peacekeepers. On to more present times, turning to the food crisis that is currently facing the world, India has proved again and again that it can respond to all sorts of humanitarian crises, be it in Ukraine, be it in Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, Yemen, and closer home, Sri Lanka. So we're a country that walks the talk, and we truly, through this, have demonstrated our great commitment, working collaboratively with different countries across the globe. And my third point is that reformed multilateralism. Now, I think you yourself said that India has been in the Security Council for the last 2 years, and we have made it very evident that the present global architecture, and I think the SG also made that point, does not serve the purpose anymore. In 1945, when the United Nations was founded, we all know there were 51 member states. Today, there are 193. Yet, the architecture of the United Nations is frozen in 1945. So how does that work? How does that even work? Clearly, it does not. So we have been arguing forcefully, we think, that the entire architecture of the United Nations needs to be reformed if it is to be made more effective, more democratic, of course, and more legitimate and more effective. And we are talking about a reform, not just in the permanent category of membership, but also in the non-permanent category, as also a reform in the working methods of the Security Council, so as to make these more democratic and thereby more effective also. So I think if you look at all of this, India is a country from 1945, when we were one of the founding members of the United Nations, to today, when we are in the Security Council for the 8th time. We are very committed multilateralists. We do believe, and we do recognize that the United Nations has its constraints. Certainly, every system has its constraints. Yet the UN has delivered a lot. And as the SG has already mentioned, I think the most evident manifestation on the ground is, of course, the presence of UN peacekeepers. And India is, of course, a very proud contributor to UN peacekeeping operations across the globe. We have also participated in various development activities on the ground in the United Nations. We have participated in humanitarian relief operations, as I've mentioned. So we are very, very committed multilateralists, and we do believe, despite all the constraints of the United Nations system, that it provides a very vital space for countries to discuss, to debate, and to collaborate. And with this mindset, I think we contribute and participate in the United Nations today. I'm very proud to represent India at the United Nations. And it is always for the greater global good that India will work for at the UN.
Thank you, ma'am.
Back